Why do we limit ourselves to just taxing income and estates or other forms of revenue or other forms of income for government revenue, at least on the federal scale? That is all that is generally taxable for any given business that is based in the United States or individual citizen of the United States. Why do we do that, given that there are vast sums of wealth held by individuals, corporations, and other organizations that are just sitting there, and these vast torpid pools of wealth that are doing next to nothing except for maybe providing lavish amounts of luxury for either individuals or perhaps in the case of something like the corporation Apple, where they build this massive, giant, new, fancy headquarters with glass walls that people run into on a regular basis and injuring themselves. But otherwise, I mean, basically, it doesn't do anybody any good. It doesn't help the retail sector for the most part, because most of the retail industry is based on consumers, general consumers, middle class Americans purchasing products, and those purchases are made by middle class people that do not have vast sums of wealth. So then the question is, why don't we tax those vast, torpid pools of wealth that exist around the country, held by individuals and corporations and other institutions? So that's exactly what I propose that we should start doing. We should implement a federal property tax that would be similar to local property taxes, only the very important difference is that unlike local property taxes, which are limited to basically taxing real estate assets, this federal property tax would cover all the assets of approximately the top 0.01% in wealth of individuals and institutions across the country. So only those would be ones that would face such a property tax. And additionally, as a measure to make sure this is not an authoritarian measure, I want to have this to be as kind and gentle a property tax as possible, the system. There would be no criminal liability for any attempts to evade this property tax. All that would happen at worst would be anybody that tries to, who this property tax would be applicable to, who tries to, say, hide some of their assets from this tax, the worst that they would face is a fine. There would be only a civil matter in terms of the tax evasion from this property tax. So this would be, so nobody can say this is really like a totalitarian, authoritarian, jackbooted thug program. This would be just a kind and gentle, not class warfare, it would be class peacefare. It would be just a simple transfer of wealth done peacefully. Nobody goes to jail. Nobody's head gets cut off. No reign of terror like in the French Revolution. Just a simple transfer of property from the haves to the have-nots. Now, there's one very important potential problem that I have a solution for, that they could also could be caused by this new tax, in that a large number of the individuals that would be facing this new property tax would have much of their holdings in the form of stock ownership. They own a lot of these billionaires, their wealth is determined by their holdings in the corporation that they are the CEO of. So the problem could happen, potential problem, where if they were to sell all of their holdings in order to pay for this property tax, that would increase the supply of the stocks, and without any increase in demand, their supply and demand economics would show that would cause the price of these stocks that they were selling. All these CEO billionaires, all of a sudden have to sell all their stocks. That could potentially cause a crash in the price of these stocks, and it could have a knock-on contagion effect on the rest of the market and crash the whole stock market potentially. So my proposed solution to that problem is that we would do is accept stocks from these billionaires in lieu of the taxes. And instead of them having to sell the stocks, the government, the people, the federal government would take ownership of those stocks, and we would form a stock market fund that would be just very similar to, say, a mutual fund or exchange traded fund, where the federal government would only get revenue in the form of dividends, either dividends or sale of shares in that fund to the general public or institutional investors. So that would be the only way that the federal government would gain revenue from that stock market fund. I propose the name of it, calling the USGF, or the United States Government Fund. It would be traded just like any other shares in any other mutual fund that you can find on the stock market. It would just be composed of all these shares that the billionaires paid to the government in the form of shares of their stock that they once owned. So now that we'd have this whole new government fund, the USGF, U.S. Government Fund, that the general public or institutional investors could buy shares in that, and then they would be the owners of the shares in that fund. But whenever they buy the shares, then the government would be getting revenue from it. So it'd be either with the sales of the shares of the USGF, or whenever dividends are paid out, then that would also be a form of revenue. But that way we would avoid any crashing of the markets due to suddenly having this huge supply of selling shares of stock on the market to pay for this tax, this new federal property tax. So that would cover that problem. So I think we could do this, and I think it should have lots of appeal, because by implementing a federal property tax, we could shift the burden away from the general middle-class public, who now has to cover most of the revenue needs for the government, and we shift that burden away from the backs of the 99, really in this case, 99.9% of the public, the voting public. So if we would shift the burden that much that we can get for revenue from this property tax away from the backs of the voting 99.9% of the general public, off their backs, you would think they'd like this. So, so I think it should have some good appeal to the general public, and I think that would be a popular thing that the voters would like to see. There's also one other huge benefit to this, having ownership on the U.S. government fund that I'm proposing. In that case, if there was such a government fund traded on the stock market, all the owners of that fund would be granted shares in the stocks that are owned by that fund, that are part of that fund. So that in that way, every U.S. citizen would be given a probably be with just a fraction of a share of that corporation that's in the fund, each corporation that's in the fund. But there'd be so many shares, of course, so many people that are owning those fraction of the shares would add up to a tremendous amount, perhaps a majority ownership of each corporation in the fund. And as a result, the U.S. people, the common folk, the ordinary plebs, would have a significant influence over how those corporations are run. It would no longer be just a few billionaires largely controlling those corporations like it has been traditionally in the past and continues to be, where it's been a plutocracy. This would be a way to peacefully overthrow the plutocracy or the corporatocracy that makes up the plutocracy, and we could use our votes to change how corporations are run. We can demand that, for instance, that a bank divest itself of a pipeline company that's building pipelines where they shouldn't be, or maybe we could own the shares in those pipeline companies themselves and tell them that they cannot lay the pipeline down over sensitive environmental lands, for instance, or American Indian lands, and instead they would have to go through existing right-of-way along roadways and such. So that's how we, the people, could essentially take over the corporations, as long as we make sure we vote on those proxy votes and implement some progressive reforms for these corporations. And so that would be a huge shift in the power in the corporatocracy of America, that this would help to transform our country into more of a true democracy, and end the make a cessation to the plutocracy. So we can just demand that these corporations start paying their employees a living wage and treating them better, for instance. So this could have a huge influence and change the whole course of this country. I hope you support it. Thank you, and good luck.